The October wind cut through the pine trees like a blade, carrying with it the scent of early snow and distant wood smoke. Marcus Chen pulled his truck up the winding dirt road that led to his grandfather's old cabin, nestled deep in the Montana Rockies. The headlights swept across the weathered wooden structure, casting dancing shadows through the dense forest that surrounded it. He'd been making this journey every few weeks for the past year, ever since he'd inherited the property. The cabin served as his refuge from the chaos of his job as a social worker in the valley below, a place where he could escape the endless cycle of broken families and system failures that defined his daily existence. Marcus grabbed his overnight bag and approached the front door, fumbling for the key in the dim light. Something felt different tonight. The usual stillness of the mountains seemed disrupted, as if the very air held its breath. He dismissed the feeling as exhaustion from another brutal week dealing with the aftermath of the recent mine closure that had devastated the local community. Inside, the cabin felt colder than usual. Marcus flicked on the generator and began his routine. Check the mouse traps, inspect the roof for leaks, ensure the small wood stove was ready for the night. But as he moved through the familiar space, details began to register that made his skin prickle with unease. The dust on the kitchen counter had been disturbed, subtle but unmistakable, finger marks near the old coffee tin where he kept emergency supplies. A can of beans sat slightly out of place in the pantry, and when he examined it closely, he noticed tiny puncture marks in the metal, as if someone had opened it with a sharp stone rather than a proper can opener. His heart began to race. Marcus grabbed the flashlight from his bag and began a more thorough search. In the main room, he found them, small, bare footprints in the dust near the fireplace. The prints were delicate, clearly belonging to a young person, maybe a teenager. But who would be out here, miles from the nearest town, in weather that was already turning dangerous? "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the small space. "Is someone here? I'm not going to hurt you." Silence answered him, but it was the kind of silence that breathed, that watched. Marcus continued his search, checking the bedroom, the storage closet, even the narrow space beneath the stairs. Nothing. But as he knelt to examine the floorboards more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Several of the boards near the far wall were slightly raised, as if they'd been recently disturbed. And there, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, was a small piece of torn fabric caught on a nail. "I know you're here," he said softly, sitting back on his heels, "and I know you're scared. But it's okay. I'm not going to call anyone or turn you in. I just want to help." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, came the sound of someone taking a sharp, frightened breath. The boards near the wall shifted slightly, and Marcus felt his chest tighten with a mixture of fear and protective instinct. Whoever was hiding beneath his cabin was terrified, cold, and probably hungry, and from the size of those footprints, they were just a kid. "My name is Marcus," he continued, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "I'm going to sit right here and wait. When you're ready, you can come out. I have food, and I can make a fire to keep you warm." The autumn wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows and reminding them both of how isolated they were, how far from help or harm. Marcus settled himself against the wall, prepared to wait as long as necessary. Whatever had brought someone to seek shelter in his cabin, whatever they were running from, he had a feeling his quiet mountain retreat was about to become the center of something much larger and more dangerous than he could imagine. 3 hours passed before she emerged. Marcus had dozed fitfully in his chair, starting awake at every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind through the eaves. When he finally heard the soft scraping of wood against wood, he kept his eyes closed, not wanting to frighten her back into hiding. The footsteps were barely audible, but he could sense her presence as she moved through the room. He heard her approach the kitchen, the quiet rustle of her searching through his supplies. Only when he heard her gasp of pain did he open his eyes. She stood frozen by the window, a piece of bread clutched in her hands, her dark eyes wide with terror. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 16 or 17, with long black hair that hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her clothes were torn and dirty, clearly handmade from rough fabric, and her feet were bare despite the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Ancient, haunted, carrying a depth of pain that no teenager should ever have to bear. "It's okay," Marcus said softly, not moving from his chair. "Go ahead and eat. You must be starving." She stared at him for a long moment, then slowly brought the bread to her mouth. Her hands shook as she ate, and Marcus noticed the cuts and scratches that covered her arms and legs. She'd been in the wilderness for some time, surviving on instinct and determination. "Do you speak English?" he asked gently. She tilted her head, studying him with the wariness of a wild animal. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, in a language he'd never heard before. The words were soft and rhythmic, like water flowing over stones, but there was an urgency in her tone that made his chest tighten. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "I'm sorry. Do you know any English? Any other language?" She tried again, switching to what sounded like Spanish, then something else entirely. Marcus caught fragments, a word here and there that sounded familiar but not quite right. It was as if she was speaking dialects of languages he almost recognized, but not quite. Growing frustrated, she pointed to herself and spoke a single word that sounded like Ayana. Then she pointed to him, raising her eyebrows in question. "Marcus," he said, touching his chest. "My name is Marcus." She nodded slowly, then repeated his name with a soft accent that made it sound like music. "Marcus." Over the next hour, they established a fragile communication system using gestures, simple drawings, and the few words they could share. She drew pictures in the dust on the floor, mountains, trees, a small group of people. When she drew what looked like vehicles and men with weapons, her hands began to shake, and she quickly erased the images. Marcus's background in social work had taught him to recognize trauma, and this girl carried it like a physical weight. She flinched at sudden sounds, positioned herself always with her back to the wall, and never let him get too close. But there was something else in her bearing, a dignity, a strength that spoke of someone who had been raised to survive, to endure. As the night wore on, Marcus prepared a simple meal of canned soup and crackers. Ayana watched him with intense curiosity, particularly when he used the can opener and lit the propane stove. She seemed familiar with fire and basic cooking, but modern tools clearly fascinated her. When he offered her the bowl of soup, she hesitated, then performed what looked like a small ritual, touching the bowl to her forehead, whispering words in her language, before taking a cautious sip. The soup was clearly too hot, but she didn't complain. Didn't make a sound of discomfort. "Where are you from?" Marcus asked, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. Ayana set down the bowl and looked at him for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice low and urgent. She gestured toward the mountains, drew more pictures in the dust, a small settlement, people working together, children playing. Then her expression darkened and she drew other images, vehicles, uniformed men, buildings being destroyed. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd heard stories throughout his career, whispered accounts of communities being displaced, of indigenous peoples being forced from their ancestral lands. But seeing the raw pain in this girl's eyes made it real in a way that case files and reports never could. "They're gone," he said quietly. Not a question, but a statement of terrible understanding. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a piece of carved stone that seemed to catch and hold the firelight. She held it reverently, whispering words that sounded like prayers or memories. Marcus realized with growing certainty that he wasn't just dealing with a runaway teenager. This girl was a survivor of something far more devastating, something that had stripped away everything she'd ever known. And now, somehow she'd found her way to his cabin in the mountains, carrying with her secrets and sorrows that the outside world might never understand. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows and reminding them both of how isolated they were. But inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and the fragile beginning of trust, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "You can stay," he said, meeting her eyes, "as long as you need to. I won't let anyone hurt you." Ayana didn't understand the words, but she seemed to grasp their meaning. For the first time since he'd seen her, she allowed herself to relax slightly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction. And in that moment, Marcus understood that he'd become more than just a shelter from the storm. He'd become her guardian, her protector, and quite possibly her last hope. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm of careful coexistence. Marcus had called in sick to work, claiming a family emergency, which, in a way, wasn't entirely untrue. He'd driven down to the valley twice for supplies, each time returning with more food, warmer clothes, and books he hoped might help bridge the communication gap between them. Ayana had transformed from a terrified wild creature into something approaching a normal teenager, though the wariness never fully left her eyes. She'd claimed the small back room as her own, arranging her few possessions with the care of someone who'd learned to treasure what little they had. The carved stone never left her side, and Marcus often caught her holding it while she whispered in her native language. Their communication had improved dramatically. Ayana was remarkably intelligent, picking up English words with a speed that suggested she'd been exposed to the language before. She taught him words from her own tongue in return, and slowly, painfully, her story began to emerge. She came from a small community hidden deep in the mountains, people who had lived there for generations, maintaining their traditional ways while staying largely invisible to the outside world. They called themselves the Nayati, the survivors, and they were all that remained of a once great nation that had been scattered and hunted until only a few dozen remained. "We hid," Ayana explained one evening as they sat by the fire, her English now good enough for basic conversation. "Always hiding. My grandmother, she tells stories of the old days when our people were many. But now—" She gestured helplessly, unable to find the words. Marcus had spent his free time researching, using his laptop and the cabin's satellite internet to dig into historical records and current events. What he found made his blood run cold. The Nayati appeared in scattered references throughout Montana's history, always as a footnote, always as a people who had vanished, been relocated, or simply ceased to exist according to official records. But they had existed, they had survived. And now, according to Ayana's halting explanation, they were gone. "Men came," she said, her voice flat with the kind of emotional numbness that Marcus recognized from his work with trauma survivors. "Government men. They say we have no right to the land, say we are not real people, not real tribe. They have papers, documents. They say we must leave." "When?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. 6 months ago. My father, he tried to fight with words, with lawyers. But they come with machines, with guns. They say our village is illegal, that we are squatters. She spat the last word like it tasted bitter. Squatters on land where my people lived for 1,000 years. Marcus felt sick. He'd seen similar stories in his work, though usually not so extreme. Land disputes, development rights, environmental regulations, all used as weapons against communities that had no political power, no voice in the systems that controlled their lives. "What happened to your family?" he asked gently. Ayana's composure cracked slightly. "They scatter us. Some go to reservation, but reservation people, they don't know us. We are not part of their tribe. Some go to cities, but city life." She shook her head. "My parents, they tried to keep us together, but it is impossible. No money, no place to go. No one believes we are real. Where are they now? Dead." The word fell between them like a stone. "My father, he gets sick in the city. No medicine, no help. My mother, she die of broken heart. My little brother, She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort her, but she pulled away. Not from rejection, but from the kind of pain that made human contact unbearable. "I am last," she said simply. "Last of the Nayati. Last to remember the old ways, the old stories. When I die, everything dies with me." The weight of that statement settled over them both. Marcus thought of his own family, his own cultural heritage, and tried to imagine being the sole custodian of an entire people's memory. The responsibility would be crushing. "The men who came," he said carefully. "Are they still looking for you?" Ayana nodded, fear flickering in her eyes. "They take everything, our sacred places, our burial grounds. They say they will build, resort. Big buildings for rich people. But first, they must make sure no one comes back, no one makes trouble." Marcus's research had hinted at this, a massive development project in the northern mountains, backed by corporate interests and rubber-stamped by local politicians. The kind of project that swept away inconvenient truths and inconvenient people with equal efficiency. "There are people who would help," he said. "Lawyers, activists, journalists, people who fight for indigenous rights." "We tried," Ayana said bitterly. "My father, he contacted many people, but we have no recognition, no federal status. Officially, we do not exist." "How do you fight for rights when the law says you are not real?" Marcus understood now why she'd been so terrified, why she'd hidden beneath his floorboards like a hunted animal. She wasn't just a refugee, she was a ghost, a living reminder of a people who had been systematically erased from history, and there were powerful interests who wanted to keep it that way. "I have been running for months," she continued, "sleeping in caves, in abandoned buildings, always moving, always watching. They have people looking for me, not just police, private security, people who do not ask questions. Why? If your people are already gone, why do they still hunt you?" Ayana's hand went to the carved stone at her throat. "Because I remember. Because I know where the sacred places are, where our ancestors are buried. And because..." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Because I can prove we were here. I can prove they murdered my people." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the October wind carried the promise of winter, of storms that would soon make the mountain roads impassable. Marcus realized that whatever choice he made now, there would be no going back. "Show me," he said quietly. Ayana met his eyes, searching for something. Trust, commitment, the kind of strength that could bear the weight of truth. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly and began to reach for her pack. What she pulled out would change everything Marcus thought he knew about justice, about power, and about the price of survival in a world that had no room for inconvenient truths. The photographs were devastating. Ayana had hidden them in a waterproof pouch, along with documents that her father had managed to preserve before their final displacement. As Marcus studied them by lamplight, he felt his worldview shifting with each image. The first photos showed the Nayati village as it had been, a collection of traditional dwellings built into the mountainside, with gardens and workshops that spoke of a people who had adapted their ancient ways to modern survival. There were maybe 50 people in total, from elderly grandparents to young children, all carrying themselves with the quiet dignity that Marcus had recognized in Ayana. The later photos were harder to look at. Government vehicles surrounding the village, uniformed men with weapons, buildings being demolished by heavy machinery, and finally, the sacred burial ground, a site that had been revered for generations, being torn apart by bulldozers. "My father, he hide camera," Ayana explained, her voice tight with remembered pain. "He know they would lie about what happened. He know they would say we left peacefully, that we were compensated fairly. But you see truth." Marcus did see the truth, and it made him sick. The documents told an even more damning story, correspondence between government officials and private contractors discussing the Indian problem and the most efficient ways to clear the land for development. There were payoffs, bribes, and what amounted to a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing disguised as legal land acquisition. "This is evidence of multiple felonies," Marcus said, his social worker training kicking in. "Conspiracy, fraud, violation of civil rights. With this, you could bring down everyone involved." "If anyone would listen," Ayana replied bitterly, "if anyone would believe that we existed in first place." Marcus was about to respond when he heard it, the distant sound of engines coming up the mountain road. His blood turned to ice. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and no one else knew about the cabin except... "Did you tell anyone about this place?" he asked urgently. Ayana was already moving, her survival instincts kicking in. "No, but they have ways of finding. They have technology, resources. They never stop looking." The engine sounds grew closer, and Marcus could see headlights flickering through the trees. Multiple vehicles, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "The back room," he said quickly. "There's a loose board behind the dresser. Hide there and don't come out no matter what happens." "Marcus, no. If they find you helped me, go, now." Ayana grabbed her pack and the documents, pressing the carved stone into his hand. "This belonged to my grandmother. She say it would protect our people. Keep it safe." She disappeared into the back room just as the first vehicle pulled up outside. Marcus shoved the stone into his pocket and tried to calm his racing heart. Through the window, he could see 3 SUVs with tinted windows. Definitely not local law enforcement. The knock on the door was firm and professional. Marcus opened it to find a man in his 40s, wearing expensive outdoor gear and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Chen, I'm Detective Morrison with the Montana State Police." He showed a badge that looked official enough. "We have reason to believe you may have encountered a fugitive, a young Native American woman wanted in connection with several crimes." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I haven't seen anyone up here. It's been pretty quiet. Mind if we take a look around just to be thorough?" "Do you have a warrant?" Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We can get one if necessary, but I was hoping you'd cooperate voluntarily. This girl is dangerous, Mr. Chen. She's been involved with eco-terrorist groups, and she's suspected of arson and assault. If you're harboring her, you could be charged as an accessory." Marcus knew it was all lies, but he also knew that powerful people could make lies become truth with enough legal pressure. "I understand your concern, but I really haven't seen anyone. I've been coming up here for solitude." Morrison gestured to his men, who began moving toward the cabin. "We'll just take a quick look. For your own safety, of course." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Marcus's life. The men searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They were thorough and professional, but Marcus could see the frustration growing in Morrison's eyes as they came up empty. "Interesting," Morrison said finally. "We had reports of someone matching her description in this area. Perhaps our information was wrong." Marcus said nothing, but his hand instinctively went to his pocket where the carved stone rested. Morrison's eyes tracked the movement, and something shifted in his expression. "You know, Mr. Chen, I should mention that there's a substantial reward for information leading to this girl's capture. $50,000. That's a lot of money for a social worker." "I wouldn't know," Marcus replied. "I haven't seen anyone." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded to his men. "We'll be in the area for a few more days. If you remember anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." He left a business card and walked toward the door. But at the threshold, he turned back. "Oh, and Mr. Chen, this girl is more dangerous than you might think. She's carrying information that could damage national security. Anyone who helps her would be considered an enemy of the state." The threat was clear, and Marcus felt his courage waver. After the men left, he sat alone in the cabin, staring at the business card and thinking about the choice he faced. He could turn Ayana in, collect the reward, and go back to his quiet life. Or he could fight a battle he was almost certain to lose, against enemies with unlimited resources and no scruples. When Ayana finally emerged from hiding, she read the decision in his eyes before he spoke. "We need to leave," he said. "Tonight." "Marcus, you don't understand what you're risking." "I understand perfectly." He pulled out the carved stone and placed it in her hands. "Your grandmother was right. This will protect your people, but not by hiding, by fighting." Gee. As they packed supplies and prepared to leave the cabin, Marcus made a series of phone calls to a journalist he'd worked with on previous cases, to a lawyer who specialized in indigenous rights, to an activist organization that had been fighting similar battles for decades. The war for the Nayati's survival was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. But they were no longer fighting in the shadows, no longer whispering their stories into the void, hoping someone, anyone, might listen. They were no longer alone, and that in itself was a kind of victory. As the battered pickup truck wound its way down the narrow mountain road in the hushed stillness before dawn, the world around them was cloaked in deep blue shadows. The headlights carved tunnels through the mist, revealing only a few feet of winding gravel at a time, a perfect mirror of the journey ahead. Marcus kept his hands steady on the wheel, the rhythmic crunch of tires over rock the only sound between them for long minutes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in the quiet hum of that descent, he realized something he hadn't dared to say aloud. Sometimes the most important battles weren't the ones you knew how to win. They were the ones you chose to fight, even when the odds were stacked against you. The ones where courage had to rise before strategy and love before certainty. Behind them, the cabin sat cold and silent. Empty now, yes, but not lifeless. Within its worn wooden walls remained the imprint of 3 weeks that had altered everything. It had been a place of shelter and revelation, of ancient stories unearthed and wounds reopened. A place where trust had been tested, tears had been shed, and where the first fragile seeds of resistance had taken root. What had begun as hiding had become something else entirely, a reckoning. And in its stillness now, the cabin held the ghosts of choices made, and those yet to come. Ahead of them, the road unfurled toward uncertainty, toward a world that might not believe them, that might fear them, that might try to silence them again. Power, after all, does not yield easily to truth, but even so they drove on, into danger, into possibility, into the fragile, flickering light of a world they might still help shape. And as Marcus glanced at Ayana beside him, watching the glow of the coming sun begin to outline the edges of her face, he saw something there that hadn't been present the day he found her hiding beneath his floorboards. Filthy, frightened, and silent. He saw hope, not naive, not blind, a hope born of pain and persistence, a hope that had survived erasure, betrayal, and centuries of silence. And in that moment, it struck him with quiet certainty. That kind of hope was powerful. That kind of hope could move people, could wake them, could start revolutions, and maybe, just maybe, it already had.